little bit on my background. I started with Trans-Australian Airlines way back in 1959 as an aircraft engineering apprentice. When I finished my time with them, I wasn't very impressed with where they wanted to put me on shift work. So I had to go at Ansett for a while. Met Sir Reginald one day. He walked in the hangar and said, "You're a new face. Tell us about yourself." Yeah, nice guy. But shortly after Ansett, a retired TA foreman and several wealthy business friends of his wanted to make a small fortune out of a large one, so they built a hangar at Albury Airport to take Fokker F-27s. Why F-27s at Albury, I don't know, but anyway, that was their decision. So I started work there and gained my AME licence, endorsements, GA types, engine, airframe, electrical instruments. And while I was at TA, of course, they had a Bell 47 J2A helicopter. I don't know why, but probably because Ansett had one. And I was very interested in helicopters as well. So fortunately, before I left Albury, I set up an engine overhaul shop, and I overhauled a couple of Lycoming engines. And one day, Neil McGuinness from Farm Air in Sale in Gippsland on the coast, he walked in and said, "You want to go and work for me? I'll give you more money." Yeah, that's great. And I've got a helicopter. So that was the start of getting interested in helicopters. So while I was with Farm Air, I got my helicopter licences, engineering. And while I was there, they did maintenance on all sorts of singles and twins as well. Some of Forrester Stevens worked from Essendon Airport. And at one stage, the Snowy Mountain scheme, Pilatus Porters. So we had a few rides in the Pilatus Porters, amazing aircraft. You come in a couple of feet off the deck, pull it into beta range, and you sink on the ground, hardly roll forward. Magic. And so after sailing Farm Air in Gippsland, I joined Airfast Helicopter Utilities. That was in the late 60s. I had my Bell 47 series engine and airframe, electrical and instrument endorsements, and that was going to give me an opportunity to move into bigger helicopters, gas turbines, etc. And they sent me off to General Electric in the, would have been early 70s, just outside Boston, the River Plant, to study the CT58 engine that they have installed in the Sikorsky S61 and S62s. So I stayed with Airfast Helicopter Utilities for a while before Esso took over. They took over the complete operation and called it the Esso Helicopter Division. I'd been one of the ship supervisors and acting chief engineer for quite a bit of time. And while I was going back to Albury, a couple of the DCA surveyors came in one day and we got talking, and they said, "If you get more experience and keep your nose clean, we may find a spot for you in DCA." Well, of course, it wasn't DCA anymore, but always remembered that. And anyway, I was at the Esso Helicopter Division for a number of years, and in 1976 I got an invite to join what was then Department of Transport, Air Transport Group, before they reinvented themselves as the Civil Aviation Authority. And I was based at Moorabbin Airport, where I did the usual things, C of A issues, auditing. And in those days we approved engineering modifications and repairs. All that's been handed back to the industry now. We don't do any of that, unfortunately. My first day at Moorabbin Airport as an airworthiness surveyor before we became, as I said, senior inspectors, I was told by the manager there that to grow a moustache. He looked too bloody young. And I was also commended on the new suit that I had. I wasn't game enough to tell that my old suit was a mauve colour with bell-bottom trousers. Wouldn't have gone too well. But yeah, so I was 10 years roughly in the Vic Tas region. did a lot of things, including setting engineers' exam papers and marking them. The usual thing, accident investigation work, which I'll discuss later on. Also, I had companies up the Latrobe Valley, like the National Safety Council, Latrobe Valley Airfield, where Gippsland Aeronautics is now, and they're well known for the aircraft that they've manufactured themselves. And the SO Helicopter Division was further up the valley. Now, in 1986, I got the offer to transfer over here to WA. I was tired of the Melbourne weather and the limited scope at Moorabbin Airport, although I spent some time also at Melbourne Airport. I had acted over east and here in the sectional district and district management's position, but I didn't want to accept anything on a permanent basis because I would have missed out on dealing with the industry closely, and of course accident investigation work, which was one of my favourites. So getting back to accident investigation work, senior inspectors used to be seconded to the Bureau of Air Safety to carry out the airworthiness aspects or the engineering aspects of aircraft accidents. You write a detailed report, goes back to BASI, and if it's a fatal accident, then it's sent to the coroner, and they have the coroner's hearing, to which the senior inspector was very often called in as an expert witness. Okay, always was a bit of a publicity hound. That was one that of myself at the Air Fast Helicopter Utilities days, having a look at the flight controls for Bell 205. The local newspaper came out and did an article on it. The next one, yes, Sikorsky S62. They were doing pilot training, they were doing run-on landings onto Lake Wellington. Of course, it's got a boat hull, so it lands on the water. The pilots had forgotten to retract the undercarriage into the sponsons, so when it hit the water, forward speed, the undercarriage was down, it cartwheeled. And we had to salvage it, which was quite a task. Managed to get a fishing boat from Lake's entrance that had a jib on it. So we lifted it up, pumped the water out, put some floats underneath it, towed it out to a boat ramp and towed it back to Longford, took it apart. It was sent up to Sydney, where our head office was, and they rebuilt it. Right, this was a good trip. This one is in Little Rock, USA, Alan Bond's Falcon Jet. I went over there to do the certification on the Falcon Jet, and there's myself, offsider, and the flight engineer of Alan Bond's outfit at the time. Now, the Falcon Jet is quite a large 3-turbine engine intercontinental jet, very nice machine. My end task was to issue a certificate of airworthiness, which included deregistration from the FAA and to have it re-registered as an Australian aircraft. Of course, the end task was to issue a certificate of airworthiness, including deregistration from the Federal Aviation Authority, and to re-register as an Australian aircraft. Also, to approve the flight manual, and when you approve the flight manual, we have to look at electrical load analysis, loading systems, and a whole lot of other things, and also flight manual supplements to make sure that all the data is there for the aircraft. Yes, we do a detailed inspection of the aircraft as well for compliance with its type certificate data sheet. The type certificate data sheet is like a specification for the aircraft. It details everything that belongs to the aircraft, and you need to check that all the part numbers are correct, serial numbers are recorded, and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite involved. And Falcon Jet, the company at Little Rock, who was doing the aircraft final rebuild, and where we were doing the COA issue, they had to be approved as an Australian maintenance organisation, which is quite a task. There are a lot of legalities involved, because you can imagine a foreign company suddenly has to act as if they're an Australian company. And when I was going through their paperwork, before I signed it all off, some of the things that they'd done, not realising that you know, they are an Australian company or were approved to act as one, that where they certified for Falcon Jet modifications, they actually were airworthiness directives, so legally I had to make sure that they certified everything as an airworthiness directive and not simply as a Falcon Jet modification. One of the humorous accident or incident that was there, that Alan Bond was providing a chauffeur-driven Cadillac from our motel out to Falcon Jet at the airport every morning. One morning the chauffeur turned up with a leak at Continental and he apologised that I hope you guys don't mind riding in the Continental. Was being a bit of a smart ass, I said to him, well, only if we have to. But he didn't accept as Australian humorous at all. He just looked at me and thought, what's this guy on about? Now this one is 1976. This was a Fletcher, as you probably have identified it as. This was my first accident investigation job on secondment to the Bureau of Air Safety. What had happened in this particular case, the pilot had minimum fuel on the aircraft and he was in the circuit area hoping to get down before his fuel ran out. He's probably done an uncoordinated turn. The fuel has drained away from the outlet from the fuel tanks. His engine's quit and he stalled and crashed in the circuit area. But everything else seemed to be okay. So that had to be what the problem was. Yes, this is an interesting machine. McCulloch J80 autogyro. I don't know why they didn't build a helicopter instead. It's quite sophisticated. It has a pusher-like homing engine, a freewheeling rotor of course, but with a rotor run-up mechanism for takeoff. Now they don't have a collective lever, they have what they call a pitch setting lever. When the lever is down, it engages a drive from the engine. So the engine is not only pushing it down the runway, but a portion of the engine power is driving the rotor system. And then when you hit 43 knots, you lift the pitch setting lever up, it increases the pitch by 3 degrees and the machine leaps into the air like a startled gazelle. They tell me it's quite something to watch one take off, although I've never seen one take off. Now the investigation, fortunately the pilot and passenger survived, they were very lucky. But the inspection revealed that the aircraft was airworthy except the low rotor RPM warning light was illuminated on impact and the audio warning horn for the low rotor RPM had been muted. They'd stuffed a rag in the horn so it wouldn't be so noisy. I spoke to the pilot in hospital and he said that the damn thing was that noisy I had to quieten it. Well, I guess it was noisy for a bloody reason, wasn't it? Yeah. Later investigation, talking to witnesses around the airport after I'd talked to the pilot, I found out that, he was flying around the circuit area and friends and their kids were down there by the side of the circuit and he was waving to them and flying around, more interested in what was on the ground. So his airspeed was decaying, so was the main rotor RPM. He didn't notice that the warning light was activated, and of course he had no audio warning. So as the airspeed was getting lower and the rotor RPM was decaying, so was the lift, and he hit the deck. Now, Mount William Summit, Grampians, Victoria, Cessna 210. The Bureau of Air Safety and myself didn't know where this guy had actually, we knew he'd crashed in the Grampians, but exactly where, we don't know. The Grampians is a mixture of mountains, it's very rugged, I think 3,500 was the highest, and that was Mount William. So we went round the farms in the neighbourhood to try and find out if anyone knew where the aircraft had actually flown, and they said yes, it was very low, it flew over us, but we don't know what happened after that. Went to one property and there was an elderly lady there who was minding it for her son and his wife. They'd gone away for a few days and she said, yes, I heard it come over very low. I raced outside to have a look and by then there was no more noise, but she said, I saw a light twinkling on top of the mountain. So we said, well, which mountain was that? She said, if you lined this fence post up with that old tree stump over there, it's above that. So when we got out a local map and had a look, yeah, it was the summit of Mount William. So next morning, the Bureau Inspector and myself went in there, and the police rescue, Victorian Police Rescue Squad, they were in there to remove the pilot, and we did the investigation. Very rugged, really tiger country. Couldn't find anything wrong with the aircraft. Obviously it was developing full power when it hit the vertical face of Mount William, just a rock face. Now this one is Hughes 500 firefighting. They were dropping what they call dade incendiaries. This was in snow country, very rugged, above Bright in northeastern Victoria. And the only way we could get up to the accident site was to go up on pack horses. Local farmer from Wandilligong Homestead and his 3 daughters are all great horse people, and the 2 of us went up on horseback, which was a really fantastic way. But coming down wasn't, so they changed horses and I got one that bolted on me. But anyway, yes, when we first got up to the accident site and had a look started looking around at the wreckage, the first thing we noticed was that there was smoke stains on the inside of what was left of the helicopter bubble, or the perspex. So straight away we realised what had happened. And the next thing that was a bit of a shock was the fact that the equipment for the dade incendiaries was actually one that I designed and made when I was back with Farm Air. Now, dade incendiaries, you've got a blob of phosphorus, a length of fuse, and a large blob of phosphorus. So you strike the small end, throw it over the side, burns along the fuse, and then it bursts into flames. And everything with the equipment was identical as to what I had made myself for Farm Air, but they'd altered the hinges and the actual periphery of the door. So what the equipment consisted of was a half door, a box on the outside that had a sealing lid. That box contained all the dades. There was a striking pad adjacent to the box, and I had a mechanism that would eject the box. It was spring-loaded in case they had a problem with it and they needed to get rid of it in a hurry. Having a look at the wreckage, everything else seemed to be in order, and the thing seemed to be that, okay, they've had an onboard fire in the dade incendiaries box. So having a look at the inside box, it was badly charred, and we just thought that this looks like what's happened. And when we got back, I had arranged for quite a bunch of incendiaries to be lit and we could have a look at it, and the dense white smoke was just unbelievable. So I think what has happened there was that the smoke had filled the cabin up. The pilot has lost visibility. He's flown into the trees. Also, I had some information from the Canadian aviation authorities, and the advice they gave me was that the engine, which is Allison 250C series engine, is rather prone to flaming out in situations where there is heavy smoke. So there was 2 prospects for the cause of the accident. It was the dade incendiaries that had ignited and the pilot lost his vision because of the heavy smoke, and also that there may have been involvement with the engine flaming out, but that was a little bit too difficult to determine. Some of you may remember this one. It was at Perth Airport. The Hiller helicopter was lifting a light onto the roof of the control tower, and when they released the light, as the pilot pulled away, the hook fouled the railings around the top of the control tower, pulled the chopper into the side of the tower and it crashed to the ground. Unfortunately, the pilot was deceased. But every indication was that there was not a problem with the helicopter itself. But, are there any fireys here? Airport fire? Yeah, this particular accident, I think it was probably the only time that the fireys have been called out in anger. They made the most of it. They tore up garden beds, they crashed through a cyclone wire fence all to get to the chopper that was on fire when it hit the deck. Robertson R22 at Shepparton, Victoria. Interesting in more than one ways. This was a high compression model engine, and this particular R22 that crashed onto a property growing grapes, and under the grapevines they were cultivating cannabis. Two crops in one. The owner of the property, I can still remember his name, Matthew Medici, that the police were in abundance at his property, and not only were they burning mounds of cannabis, which smoke was going everywhere, so we were all in a very good mood that day. Matthew's father had tried to stop him growing cannabis. He did away with his father, wrapped the body up in chicken mesh and concrete and dumped it in the local river. But he was actually in police custody, but they had him at the house and they were looking for more evidence. So they brought him out, the police superintendent brought him out, and I met him. I wouldn't turn my back on him, he wasn't a very nice guy at all. Okay, getting back to the accident, I spoke to the pilot and I said, well, what happened? And he said he thought he had a tail rotor problem. Well, then I spoke to some witnesses and they said, no, the engine seemed to be faltering, missing and surging. So that gave a good indication of what we might have to look at to start with. Now, when I got to the inside of the cabin, I found out that the pilot was carrying his own fuel in small jerry cans. And so the first thing I did was to drain a bit of fuel out. It looked like it was MoGas. So I put that in a bottle and sealed it so I could send it off to Materials Testing Laboratory in Sydney just to verify what it was. It was not ideal for a high compression engine. Yes, the pilot said he'd recently refuelled, so I pulled off the fuel filter assembly, opened it up to the screen, and the screen was chock-a-block full of chips of paint and rubbish. So I bundled that off as well to send up to MTL in Sydney and get them to analyse it. And yes, they said that it had come from the interior of the jerry cans. So we had the answer there to why the machine had crashed. The engine was losing power because there was insufficient fuel, and it was MoGas, which wasn't ideal for a high compression engine either. MTL had verified that, yeah, that's where the material, the rubbish had come from, and as I thought, it was MoGas. Now this one made quite a ripple in Victoria and the news media. It went on for quite some time. It was a Bell 206. It was actually chartered for Channel 7 permanently, but they were doing other charter work as well. A multi-millionaire land developer had chartered it to fly down to the islands in Western Port Bay in Victoria, do some filming. He wanted to set one of them up as a holiday centre. And they were flying back to Moorabbin Airport, flying parallel to the South Gippsland Highway, when they noticed there'd been a bad car accident and the police were in attendance. So I had a very good witness there in the Senior Sergeant of Police. I asked him, did he see the accident? He said yes, saw every bit of it. The police sergeant said that as he was watching the aircraft, he thought the helicopter had flared out rather forcefully. The nose was particularly high and it had gone into a spin hit the ground and burst into flames. So in looking at the wreckage, I noticed that the forward skid tube had struck the ground first, ripping away the undercarriage box to which the undercarriage legs are attached, the cross tubes. And the inside of the structure there, the fuel cell, which is a bladder type fuel cell, it is laced to the aluminium alloy structure. So as that was torn out, it tore the bottom of the fuel cell out. It dumped a massive amount of fuel as it was spinning. And the fuel cell actually sits in the Bell 206, sits under the passenger seats. And its composite panels around form the seat structure. In the right-hand corner, there was a very small amount of unburnt seat structure left, but it obviously had also ruptured on impact, and fuel had sprayed through the cockpit. And this was more or less verified by the unfortunate pilot. His helmet was very badly burnt on the right-hand side, which aligned with that end of the fuel cell, and the other side was practically unburnt. So we had fuel inside and outside the helicopter. Now the ignition source was no problem finding that. It was undoubtedly, as the battery collapsed, it had moved forward into the battery relay, which was only about 3 inches forward and slightly below the battery mounts. One of the terminals on the battery had struck the opposite polarity on the relay, and we had a massive spark. It had arced away at least half the studs, so and you could match them up, there was no doubt about that. So they had a very large spark which ignited the fire. Do we have any ex-helicopter pilots here? No. There was an idea that maybe tie rotor stall could have come into the situation as well, but some pilots say they've encountered tie rotor stall, others say that it doesn't exist, so we don't know about that. There was another consideration, was that most of the tail boom was still intact, and the tie rotor control tube had an unauthorised modification on it, which was helping to prevent the tube from where it goes through a fair lead from wearing, and replaced by, if you bought one, they're fairly expensive, so the outfit that owned the machines thought they'd do this modification. I got some additional help from Central Office in Canberra, engineering help, just to verify that they thought this wouldn't have affected the helicopter at the particular time. So we both agreed that it wouldn't. As my report was going to the coroner, I wanted to be 100% sure on anything that might have been a problem. Now, my accident investigation report has to go to the Bureau of Air Safety, and if it's a fatal accident, it is then forwarded onto the coroner. And I've been in the coroner's court a number of times with accident investigation work as an expert witness in the box, and in this particular case, I was in the box for 2 days facing 11 QCs. I couldn't quite believe it that all those QCs, with the exception of one, had not a pilot or an engineer to assist them. It's a fairly technical thing, and then there's the air navigation regulations, aviation law to consider. They didn't know anything about it. There was no problem, with the exception of one of the QCs, Jeffrey Sher QC, I won't forget his name. He was a nasty looking character, and his demeanour was exactly the same. He was a bit of a bully. He liked quoting at me half a sentence or half a paragraph and then trying to bully me into saying, yeah, that's correct, when in actual fact what he was doing was trying to alter the context of what I'd written. And Mr. Scher and myself had quite a number of words to say to each other, and I thought, oh boy, any minute one of us is going to be in contempt of court. So I looked across at the coroner, he just winked and gave me the thumbs up, and I thought, oh, okay, that's good. The coroner was Kevin Mason QC, a really nice guy, and he invited me for a drink after the first day of the court case, and he informed me that there was no contempt of court in the coroner's court. I wished I'd have known earlier on. Yeah. But at the completion of the accident investigation and the coroner's court appearance, I received a citation from Canberra, and that was very gratifying that someone appreciated your efforts. And also following that, back at Moorabbin Airport, I had a visit from a couple of TV companies to take them down to the crash compound and just explain what we actually do with accident investigation work. That was just another shot. I was called out to an accident in Lilydale, which is east of Melbourne, at the beginning of the Latrobe Valley. Cherokee 6. Fortunately, there were no fatalities. It was a cold, drizzly day, typical day where you'd expect carburettor ice. In fact, looking at the graph, it was right in the middle of the graph. And apparently the pilot was coming in on finals. He was undershooting. He wanted to open the throttle a bit more and pick the nose up. The throttle was jammed. He went into a ditch just before the piano keys, and he was lucky that the angle he hit the ditch on, it threw him out of it, and he crashed down onto the piano keys. The aircraft was destroyed. It was very badly bent and twisted, but it was all in one piece. So they survived with just a bit of a beating. Now, I spoke to the pilot as to what had happened, and he told me that story, and he said I had carburettor heat selected. And this guy seemed to be so genuine, I thought, yeah, there's got to be a problem here. And anyway, when I got into the cockpit myself, with much difficulty, I could still move the carby heat, and the throttle could be moved. So, like I said, I was so convinced that this guy was telling the truth, I pulled the throttle cable out and sent it up to materials testing laboratory in Sydney and asked them to do an X-ray and then put it onto a cycling machine. So would you believe they X-rayed it and they found an internal fault in the throttle cable, where there's a number of strands of wire that are forming the actual cable itself. One of those wire strands is broken, it bent back on itself, and every now and then, or at least once, it would jam. And they also put it onto a cycling machine, 80 plus cycles, they got it to jam. So with the information I had, I sent it off to central office, and for their action, maybe they wanted to raise an airworthiness directive or whatever, but that was their action. I also went out to an accident with a Robinson R22 out into the wheat fields. Young guy was flying the chopper. It was going to be delivered up north. He was flying along in cruise, I suppose 85 knots, 2,000 feet or thereabouts, and the whole tail boom dropped off. And he tumbled through the air, crashed into the farmer's paddock, and picked himself up with a broken finger. The most unbelievable accident I've ever seen in my life. It appeared there that their tail rotor was a problem, vibration and failure of the tail boom attachment points due to the vibration. Yeah, this is not an accident, but it was just something that happened to me at the SO Helicopter Division. I had a Bell 206 that wouldn't fly smoothly, and it had a horrible one-to-one vertical vibration. We couldn't get rid of it. And I tried to convince the management that we had a mismatched blade, and they said that's rubbish. But one of them had been to the States, they'd been to Bell Helicopter Factory. All their main rotor blades are made on the same jig. How can they be different? The chief pilot said to me, "You're doing the wrong thing, Noel." I said, "Okay, let's get out there and sort it out." So I got out to the machine and I said, "You tell me what you want to do." And he said, "I'll bend the tab down on that blade to its maximum," which was 6 degrees. I bent it down to 9 degrees just to prove a point. And he started the machine up, got up to around about 90% NR, and it was rocking so badly on the skids I thought it was going to go into ground resonance, in which case it could have thrashed itself to death. So I disappeared very quickly, went back to the hangar and well away from the area where the chopper was. He managed to get the thing under control, and as he was walking back, I was walking out to meet him. He didn't want to talk to me. He just gave me a dirty look. I know he'd had a scare. I know I certainly did. And I got my main rotor blade, and it flew beautifully after that. Also had a demonstration flight in a Volco MB-105 where we did aerobatics in a helicopter. Absolutely amazing. I never did a loop. I wanted to get them to do one, but they did barrel rolls and tight turns and everything else. It was a lovely machine to fly in. Now this next story is just, it's a bit humorous. I was on detachment to Wynyard, the north coast of Tassie, from the main base at Longford. I had a company car and they said, go to Melbourne, pick up the caravan, put it on the ferry, go across the north coast of Tassie, you land at Launceston and drove up to Wynyard Airport, and they had a spot there for us to set the caravan down because we had the radio gear. We used to monitor the aircraft all the time with their own radio system. So then I radioed back to Longford that everything was right for the next morning. They'd sent a couple of Bell 205s down. So my offsider, who was an ex-Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm guy, nice bloke, Ted, I said to him, let's go and have an ale. So the local pub was not too far down the road. We walked down, walked into the bar, I ordered a couple of drinks. And as we walked into the bar, there was two old ducks sitting down, old deers, sitting down at the bar. They had aprons on, hair nets, and one of them was smoking a fag she'd rolled herself. It looked like something out of Coronation Street. And anyway, after I'd ordered a beer, one of them said to me, "Oh, where do you come from, love?" And I said, "Oh, we're Australians." And that didn't go down too well. Did I cop a bloody broadside? She said, "Yeah, I know your type. You're a smart ass from the mainland." "Well, you made Manders. You could bloody well go back to the mainland." So anyway, Ted gave me a dig in the ribs and he said, "You've got to be nice to the locals, Noel. You can't be like that." So I apologised and I bought them a beer, and yeah, we become good friends after that. Yeah, another case of one-upmanship. Ansett were running a BA 146 airframe course at the Ascot Hotel. I'd already done the airframe course myself, but I was there to monitor the course content and compare it to our syllabus, and if it met the syllabus, I was to recommend it for Central Office for approval for Ansett. It was in the middle of summer, because Ansett had one of the conference rooms where they had their instructors and everything set up. And we had a room at the back of the hotel for our luncheons, and as it was summer, the big double doors to that room were open, and you've got a grassed area that runs down to the river. So I had finished my lunch, had half an hour to spare, thought I'd go for a walk down the river. And only about 50 metres down, there was a whole group of trees. As I walked past the trees, I was quite surprised to find that there was a jetty there. And I was standing on the jetty. I'm watching this launch come up the river. It was 30 odd foot, I suppose. And there were three young lovelies in their bikinis sunbathing on the front, on the foredeck of the boat. And while I was standing on the jetty, the boat pulled in. They threw me the rope and I tied him up. And the skipper of the boat said, "Do you mind staying with the girls?" So, "Well, only if I have to." And he said, "I'm going up to get some cold beer." So he was back in 10 minutes. And I said, "I've been talking to the girls and I've got something worked out with them. Can you do us a favour when you start to drive away from the jetty? Take it very easy. As you get up past the trees, just give me time to get back." And I got back to the rest of the Ansett guys. No one had said anything because it was just usual to go for a walk after lunch. And then the boat pulled out from behind the trees, which everyone caught their attention. The three young ladies in their bikinis were standing up on the foredeck, yelling out, "Well, we'll see you later, Noel." Nice knowing you, Noel. Comments for the Ansett guys I can't repeat here, but yeah. But that made my day anyway. Yes, when I was with Esso bought a square engine Merlin from King Ranch in the USA, complete with a bullet hole. It had a bullet hole in the rear part of the cabin. Been repaired, it hadn't been repaired very properly, so as I was in charge of doing the Australian Certificate of Airworthiness on it, I thought, well, okay, they've got to repair that. Yeah, had a look at the rest of the aircraft, found a small crack in the spar of the tailplane, and that was one other thing that has to be repaired. Anyway, part of the Certificate of Airworthiness issue, you've got quite a few ADs to do. One of them was Hose 1A, which LAMEs will recognise, where you test the hose to 1.5 times maximum working pressure, flexing it, and then you do a bore check. Well, all the hoses were done, all the other work was finished. It was finished right on time for the big inaugural flight of SO from KSA down to Sale. The company had hired flight facilities. They have sort of a small terminal at Kingsford Smith Airport for corporate type jets. Anyway, when the day before this big flight was due, did the run up with the pilot, did power checks, checked everything, no leaks, everything was fine. Went back to the motel, came out early in the morning. We went through the whole procedure again because this was very important, this inaugural flight. And SO had invested a lot of money in it. And we took off from Bankstown, halfway to KSA, the main oil pressure oil line blew out. So we had to shut down the port engine. So we landed at KSA, as usual. You know, you're met by the fireys and the ambulance, and they follow you all the way back. So we turned up outside Flight Facilities Terminal with one engine shut down and the retinue of fireys and ambulances, so the management were very impressed. I left the pilot deal with the management while I went off and got a new hose made up, got some oil, got a couple of cleaners, we cleaned the aircraft, and we got away 3 hours late, and I was sitting up front with the skipper, and we had the cockpit door closed, but 15 minutes into the flight there was a knock on the door and they come out and tell us what happened. Well, trying to convince management that, you know, vagaries of aircraft maintenance, this is the sort of thing that can happen occasionally. They wouldn't have a bar of it. Anyway, they had to get over it. Ansett, they had an F-28 flight that went into Port Hedland. It landed, taxied up to the terminal. The cabin crew had unlatched the door, give it a shove, and it crashed down onto the ground and damaged the top edge of the door. I didn't know this. This was the morning flight, that aircraft in the afternoon. I was to do an audit, mainly checking the documents and the condition of the aircraft. So after lunch I walked in the hangar, the aircraft was there waiting, but the main cabin door was off, and there were half a dozen maintenance staff standing around the door. When I walked in, they all disappeared except one of their own inspection department people. And I walked up to the door and I could see, yes, the door had been damaged. I said, what happened? He said, the retract rod is broken. I said, yeah, okay, but why did the retract rod break? Rubbish gets caught in the lower hinge. The lower hinge is like a very heavy piano hinge, some exotic aluminium alloy, maybe 707-5T6, but something that's pretty tough. And yeah, I couldn't see any rubbish there, but there were some small grooves that had actually been cut into the hinge. So the next thing, I looked at the retract rod. Yep, okay, I'll get the worksheets from the night before and find out what work had been done. So yes, there'd been maintenance carried out on the main cabin door, and what they'd actually done, they'd replaced a bell crank inside the door, to which all the radial rods going out to the latch pins for the main cabin door, and you have to take off the stress plate to get to the actual bell crank, and that plate is held in place with 10mm countersunk screws. So when I discovered this, I went straight to the stores and I got one of those screws, went back and laid it in the lower door hinge, and all the grooves matched beautifully. So obviously what had happened is the maintenance staff the night before, during the change of the bell crank, they'd knocked all the screws down into the door area and decided that, well, we've lost them, we'll go and book out a new set of screws. Well, that's what caused the problem. So we had some counselling to do, to talk to the people that were involved, to tell them that this just wasn't good enough. Another, yes, Part Navy. Part Navy, when I was over at Moorabbin, came in with one engine shut down. A control tower wanted to go up and have a look. Nothing we can talk about, it was just an engine failure. But in actual fact, the engine was wobbling around in its cowling so badly that it was starting to chop up the cowls, and they had to shut everything down. When they got back, I got it into the hangar. We got the cowls off it. Yes, part of the engine mount frame had fractured. And the next thing would be we check the engine mount bolts to the structure, and yeah, they were all loose. Why were they loose? They should have been torqued up in the factory. So we pulled one of them off, and they're typically a high tensile bolt which has a fillet under the head, so you don't have fatigue problems with bolts. And of course you have to have a countersunk washer that matches that fillet. Well, I had the countersunk washers all right, but they'd been assembled the wrong way round. And this was done in the factory, because the aircraft had only done a couple of 100 hours. So also after that, I thought, well, I'd better have a look and see where else on the aircraft the same setup may be. And I was correct, the undercarriage setup was the same. When we jacked the aircraft up, the undercarriage was loose, but it hadn't done any damage. So that was a problem during manufacture, because the aircraft had only done a very short time. Now, there was a de Havilland heron at Labbertouche Airfield, which is just part of the way into Latrobe Valley, and about 70 kilometres further east is Latrobe Valley Airfield. That heron had been there for quite some time, I'm not sure exactly how long. It had been derelict. There was no certificate of airworthiness. It wasn't airworthy because, or wasn't supposed to be airworthy anyway, because the main wing spars were badly corroded. But suddenly it appeared at Latrobe Valley Airfield, and the next day I was going up to Esso and they asked me to drop in and find out what the story was. So I went round Latrobe Valley Airfield. No one knew anything about it. No one saw it come in. No one saw any strange people around the airfield. So we couldn't get an answer for it, but it's amazing. It suddenly appeared there. Not one person knew anything about it. Another incident I had with when I was with Esso helicopters that was quite scary. Esso have a Christmas party every year, and they try and outdo themselves. Of course, each year is bigger and better than the previous. And this particular Christmas, they had permission to use Refuge Cove Beach down on Wilson's Promontory. The only way you can get in there normally is by boat, or if you're a bloody mountain goat, you've got to climb down all these rock faces to get in there. The beach was big enough that we could fit half a dozen Bell 205s on. So we had all the people that were going to the party, plus food, drink and everything else flying down. I was in the last chopper in the fleet going down. My wife was with me. The CO of the RAF base was with us with his wife and a couple of other people from Sale. I knew the aircraft wasn't flying properly at all. It seemed to be tail heavy. It couldn't keep up with the rest of the fleet. Thought that, yeah, maybe there's a problem with loading. And I stuck my head over the back of the front seat, looked at the pilot, and he just looked at me and shook his head. And I could see where the cyclic stick was. And I thought, that's not normal either. It's a little bit too far forward. Yeah, he just whispered to me, I could read his lips, don't say anything. So we managed to get down there, landed on the beach. And the first thing I did was to check how the aircraft was loaded. It was way beyond the rear limit of the loading graph. What had happened was that one of the tarmac crew had been told to put more beer into one of the aircraft. So all these slabs of beer into the aft locker in the tail boom, which of course is load limited, way over its limit. Never told the pilot or anyone else. But that was a bit scary actually, because to have, loading an aircraft up way beyond the aft limit is like, and what problems it could cause. It was an interesting one. I mentioned this one because it's online as well. Frederick Valentich. He wasn't an overly successful pilot, but he was a tryer. He was flying a Cessna 182, a night VMC from King Island across Bass Strait into Moorabbin Airport. I heard all these radio messages. He sent one to air traffic control, rather stressed out at the time, and this was just after nightfall, and he said there was a green light flying around his aircraft. It had flown off at great nights, then it come back and it was buzzing him again, and he was really worried. He thought it was some sort of a UFO. And at the end of the next radio forecast, which was more or less a repeat of that information, we could hear this metallic screeching sound, and Frederick and his Cessna 182 disappeared, and no one's ever found the wreckage or anything. But Bass Strait, I suppose, is very unforgiving in that respect. But Frederick also had a phobia about UFOs. So, we thought that maybe at one stage he'd become inverted. He was looking at reflections, but who knows? It had nothing to go on really. The National Safety Council of Australia Victoria Division, a really interesting outfit. Some of you may remember the CEO, John Friedrichs. The police picked him up down at Rockingham. John had gone for a bit of a tour around the country. Anyway, the police took him back to Victoria, where they were looking at what charges they would lay against him, because he was building the National Safety Council up. They started with one Hughes 500. They had a huge fleet of helicopters, they had a lot of other things. And John was a great organiser, and he'd actually flown in from New Zealand into Melbourne, and they think his name was Johann Frederick Hohenberger, not John Friedrichs. John Friedrichs had left Melbourne, went up the top end and then came back to the Latrobe Valley and became the CEO of the National Safety Council of Australia. Anyway, when John was picked up here, because they discovered that he was wanted for fraud back in Germany. Well, he wasn't really wanted. The statute of limitations has already expired, but the police here, the government was trying to pin something on John by way of what sort of charges that they would have, whether it was fraud. But in the end, there was a lot of confusion because John hadn't used any of the funds for his own personal gains, and he built up this huge outfit. And there was 2 books written about it. One John wrote himself, which I've got both, and the other one was written by the financial people, and they call that book The Fraud. Anyway, John couldn't take what had happened. He had a little property outside Sale. He went back one afternoon, went down near the property and shot himself. So out of one of those books, I finally got what the National Safety Council, all the gear they had when it was wound up. Out of the book, this is what it said from the Hughes 500 when I first went as their assigned inspector. They had 24 helicopters, Bell 205s and 212s, so they're quite reasonable sized choppers, 14 passengers each. 4 twin engine fixed wings, a BA 125 jet, amazing, several sea rescue vessels, a 588-tonne ship, a midget submarine, earth-moving equipment, snowmobiles, buses, 40 Mercedes-Benz trucks, and the Beach 200, of which I knew they had because I'd done the airframe and electrical course on it with them to sort the course out. So yes, we have get into some of these amazing situations. That company was just unreal. In 1983 they had an Aero Commander that crashed into Bass Strait. The aircraft was sinking, the pilot was in the water with his life jacket on. Ansett F-27 was flying around. They were radioing back to finally to the Rescue Coordination Centre in Canberra. The National Safety Council wanted to go out and pick him up because they had parajumpers who would jump in the water out of aircraft, parachute down. They were highly trained for all this stuff, but of course they're going to have to pay for it. And the Rescue Coordination Centre were looking for a fixed wing that could drop a life raft. By the time they'd sorted all that out and they got aircraft down there looking for him, both the pilot and the aircraft had disappeared. So once again, in Bass Strait, and he was never found. Strange things happened from time to time with the SO Helicopter Division. That we got a call from one of the oil rigs. It wasn't unusual to see ships going past the oil rigs. They'd dump rubbish, they'd flush out their tanks. SO would get the blame because they'd say it was rubbish from the oil rigs, and SO would have to clean up the beaches, the 90 Mile beach. This particular day we were having a quiet time at the helipad, and the manager came to me and he said, "Quick, Noel, we're going to catch it. This ship, you use the camera." So we flew out there. The ship was doing 30 knots and it was unloaded. Of course, it was very high in the water. So I took photographs all the way around it. And the last photograph I was taking of the deck, the aft deck, and we'd probably been 30 metres out from the boat and just a few metres above the deck height. And this sailor stepped out with a rifle, aimed right at us. So we waved goodbye and disappeared back to the helipad. And the photographs that I'd taken were sent to the Maritime Control Centre at the Port of Melbourne, and they would take up any action after that. But it was great to do all those sorts of things. It was just something from the extraordinary work. We had a Bell 205, which is one of ours at SO. The pilot had complained about tail rotor pedals being graunchy. They were rough, not very smooth at all. And yeah, so I was on morning shift with my crew and we're just about finished to go home. And the late shift had just come in, and there was half-hour changeover between the two shifts so that we could tell each other what we'd done and what needed doing. And the chief engineer told the shift supervisor for the late shift, get up and have a look at it, and they found out, yeah, the tail rotor pitch change links had, the chain had stretched, so the links were riding up on the sprocket and the chain was rubbing against the chain guard. So, in a very bad move, he asked the other ship supervisor to take the chain guard off, but tighten up the cables a bit, so a bit more tension, which would keep the chain more in contact with the sprocket for when the pilot uses the pedals. And I disagreed wholeheartedly, but never thought anything more about it. Went home and left them with it. Next morning, we were having the milk run. Each Bell 205 would probably take 8 of them off. They would have 14 passengers on board, the pilot and co-pilot as well. I was on one pad, and the pad next to me was the chopper from the night before, where they actually removed the chain guard. Well, as he lifted off, he's only a couple of metres off the ground, moved his stick slightly forward, the cyclic, so as he could go into translational and climb out. The aircraft started spinning. And this particular pilot was one of the best pilots I've ever known in my life. And if it had been anyone else, we would have had a disaster on the helipad. But as he was spinning, he was still climbing out. And once you reach 35 knots airspeed, the tail rotor pylon will give you a keel surface effect. So even though you've got no effective tail rotor pedals, you can fly straight, or relatively straight and level. But the big problem was he couldn't come back and land. You couldn't land on the oil rigs like that. You go into a spin, lose control, and you've got fatalities and a major problem. And he couldn't land back at the helipad. You can't keep flying around forever. So what the management decided was that we'll do a run on landing on one of the salt lakes, very shallow water, 6 inches of water, 2 foot of mud. The lakes along the coast. The main road goes along the coast as well to Locksport, which is a holiday resort. So the chief engineer and myself got out there. We had borrowed an 8 metre aluminium ladder from the gas plant over the road from the helipad. Got out there and with great difficulty got it up to the chopper and put it against the opposite side of where the tail rotor is. I got up, re-rigged the tail rotor controls and refitted the chain guard. And anyway, we started the chopper up and moved him away very carefully because we couldn't get the aluminium ladder back out of the mud. Two of us tried desperately to try and get it out. There was just no way we could do it. So we left the chopper fly off and we went back to the helipad. And I don't know what people thought about it, driving along the coast road to see 6 metres of aluminium ladder sticking out of Salt Lake. How would you explain that? Never made the local papers, which I was very much surprised. But in SO have a lot of say in the town, so you know maybe they kept it under wraps. But yeah, the aluminium ladder was stuck out of the middle of this Salt Lake for about 5 or 6 hours. Till later in the day we had a chopper that we had hours to spare on, so they flew out and they pulled it out on the cargo hook of a Bell 205 and took it back to the helipad. But yeah, just one of those things that would never happen again, but interesting. But well, that's me finished.
Well done, Noel.
Oh, right.